So much for joining us today. My name is Shelley Shepherd. I'm the Program Manager of New Waterways. New Waterways is an incorporated association, and our program partners I would like to acknowledge are the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attraction, the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, the Western Australian Local Government Authority, Association, sorry, WALGA, the Water Corporation and the Urban Development Institute of Australia. So we get together and we try and facilitate the improved delivery of water-sensitive urban design and water-sensitive cities. I would like to acknowledge today that I am sitting on Wajak Noongar Budja, and I would like to acknowledge the incredible values with which the Aboriginal people have cared for this land. Their custodianship over the past 40,000 years is something that I think that we can learn from so significantly, and I would like to acknowledge elders past and present. And I would like to acknowledge, or you guys feel free to acknowledge the country that you're on. Please feel free to put it in the chat. So I know you can all see some names up there, so if there's somebody you wanted to say hi to, please also put that into the chat. So I know there's a poll on the screen which would probably be a little bit confusing to the new people, but I just thought we'd stick it out there and say, what are the issues that we have that we're seeing out there now? What is our next big watery thing that we want to try and address? So I think that's my, I'm just going to leave that poll there just until we close. But that's my introduction. So it is 2 minutes past 10. So I think we might get going. Jules, you're all right if I kick off and I'll introduce you?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So today's webinar is The Big Squeeze. It's maintaining the green infrastructure role of estuarine foreshores while adapting to sea level rise, which is such a it's going to be something that we're really going to challenge us in the future. So I'd like to introduce our fabulous speaker, Dr. Julian Bolleter. He is a co-director of the Australian Urban Design Research Centre, otherwise known as AUDRIC, at UWA. His role includes teaching a master's program in urban design and conducting research projects for the West Australian State Government. Julian is an experienced urban designer and has worked in design offices in Australia, USA, the UK and the Middle East. He's completed a PhD and has commercially published 6 books, and they're beautiful. Jules' research interests are new city development, urban infill development, and the design of multifunctional public open space. And Julian has received funding from the Australian Research Council, Healthways, and the West Australian Government. So this presentation, I'm so excited, it's going to explore ideas to better sustain our critical foreshore environments. Hi, Colma, how are you? And they're being squeezed by rising sea levels and pressures from the increasing need for built infrastructure as a result of population growth. It will test the conventional sea level rise strategies of fortification, accommodation and retreat, and we're going to use a case study in Western Australia to understand the implications for the foreshore ecosystem service provision. Please welcome Julian to share the results of this great analysis. Jules, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. Great to have a forum and an opportunity to present this work. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me.
Thank you.
Okay, you should all be seeing a slide there. Hopefully you are.
We are. Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you for having me. So in the 20th century and the 19th century, around the world, urban waterfront redevelopment was really able to shape coasts and rivers and estuaries. And Bunninbiro, otherwise known as Perth Water, which is the big estuarine sort of lake in front of the city, was no exception. In the 19th and 20th century, there was vast reclamation programs employed to create handsome foreshore parks befitting a state capital city and replete with open space for recreation. Nonetheless, in the 21st century, and beyond, hydrological systems will reassert their power to shape cities. So the inverse will begin happening. Indeed, the foreshores of Perth Water, unless we do anything, will be reclaimed by sea level rise, perhaps in a truer sense of the word reclamation, defined as the process of claiming something back or reasserting a right. So the presentation I'll give today is in 2 halves. The first half, which is looking upriver, really documents how we have reshaped this landscape of Bunninbiro and its foreshores to our own agendas. In the second part of the presentation, which is looking downriver, we'll be looking at different scenarios for sea level rise and consider how they may reshape the city. And we'll also be looking at design responsives, which will be both about I guess, adjusting to new water levels, but also looking at how can we maintain the ecosystem service provision of the Central Perth Regional Parklands, which the Perth foreshores are part of. So how do we balance that? It basically, the presentation is not meant to be all doom and gloom. There is I think, an idea underpinning it that in a way sea level rise will offer us a catalyst for doing things differently. And really this presentation is about documenting what that catalyst could be used to garner. So looking upriver to begin with. So the Swan River has been what we call the Swan River, or the Derbyl-Yarragon, has been flowing for some 60 million years, it's a truly ancient river despite its fairly modest meandering and muddy sort of quality. The full sense of that geological timescale is indicated by the Perth Canyon, which you should be able to see here, which is about 5 k's northwest of Rottnest, which is much, much bigger than the Grand Canyon. This is a canyon that the Derbyl-Yarragon has worn away into the continental shelf over this 60 million period of flowing. So it is an amazingly old river. For the Noongar, the Woggle, a snake-like dreamtime creature, was responsible for the creation of the Swan and Canning River, or the Derbyl-Yarragon, as well as all other waterways and landforms throughout the southwest. So the Woggle is a spirit of creation, but also a spirit responsible for punishing wrongdoers through illness and even death. And we can see here with the Woggle, as was described by Ken Colbung, wriggling its way through Yuundarup and Madagarup here, creating these archipelago of islands to gain access to Perth water, digging down into these what were referred to as Woggle holes at the base of what is now the Swan Brewery, then ascending the cliffs through Mount Eliza through to Kings Park. For the Europeans, the Dutch came and they correctly surveyed the Swan coastal plain as being fairly barren from the perspective of European agriculture, and those initial voyages did not lead to European settlement. However, the surveying of the fertile upper section of the Swan eventually fell to Captain Stirling, English sea captain, and his botanist Charles Fraser. And as they sailed up the Swan River, they were particularly taken with the beauty of the landscape and were obviously inspired by it. In his journal, Stirling evoked how the richness of the soil, the bright foliage of the shrubs, the majesty of the surrounding trees, and the view of the Blue Mountains, which are not far distant, made the scenery of the spot as beautiful as anything of the kind I've ever witnessed. So really, this was Swan River mania, as it became known in England, this romanticisation of the Swan River and its landscape. They did their only soil testing in Guildford and presumed the rest of the Swan coastal plain would be that productive. Of course, they got it totally wrong. But this idea of the Swan River as this kind of botanic Arcadia linger, and you can see that enshrined in the first plan for Perth, which was from 1833, which proposed a generous foreshore park here, which you can see running between what was Point Fraser right through to William Street. So a really generous foreshore park, which would kind of allow us to maintain a segment of this Swan River, this bountiful Arcadia of the Swan River at the foot of the city. However, when Governor Stirling was on leave in 1838, his surveyor Septimus Roe had the park subdivided for private redevelopment. This led to Karl Marx citing Perth as an example of the failures of capitalism. Such was the rampant nature of land development in the early days of the colony. So not long after the settlement, the mood turned to one of actually starting to dominate the river. And really, since some of the earlier settlement, the Swan River was deemed problematic. The lakes adjacent and swamps produced plagues of mosquitoes. Perth was described at the time as swarming with fleas and mosquitoes, and that a more perfect purgatory couldn't be devised. The wetland landscapes to the north and south of the city, in conjunction with inadequate sewage, also started to produce typhoid outbreaks. But what happened when Stirling returned from leave was that he bought, using his own lands, the land which now forms the Government House Gardens, as a kind of remnant of this larger idea of a park on the foreshore of the city. So there is a memory of what that foreshore park could have looked like if indeed we had kept it. It would have been topographically interesting and much more of a diverse landscape. However, that wasn't to happen, and we can see here in this City of Perth plan, by around 1900, The old foreshore park that Sterling proposed is then really entombed under private redevelopment, but we get propositions for the reclamation of a recreation ground between William and Barrack Streets. And in a way, this is sort of an unconscious impulse to replace that park that has been lost. The reclamation of that, and then later reclamation works along the foreshore, was done using street sweepings from Perth, and also the soil that was produced by demolishing hills within the central Perth town site that would be moved out of the foreshore and used for reclamation. So the initial reclamation effort sought the reclamation of the Esplanade in the 1880s, and then continued with the South Perth foreshore and Langley Park in the 1930s. And finally, Harrison Island, Victoria Park and South Perth foreshores in the 1950s. In total, we reclaimed about 600 hectares of riverfront, or the equivalent of 300 MCG ovals. So this was a huge exercise. And the reasons for the vast program of reclamation were mixed. Some of it was about the pragmatic reclamation of space for recreation. It was regarded that Queen's Park was too small and Kings Park was too far away, and that Central Perth, as part of City Beautiful and Garden City thinking, needed more recreational open space. But there was also a symbolic component to this. By the 1880s, the marshy riverine landscapes of Perth Water become regarded to be as a kind of noisome marsh, a mosquito-breeding morass, and that they needed to be beautified via infilling and turfing, to create a handsome foreshore park befitting of a capital city such as Perth. In psychoanalytic theory, too, water is symbolic of the unconscious, and the Swan River from a Western perspective is associated with indigeneity. And in this reading, the reclamation of the river reads as an attempt to bury Indigenous history beneath a layer of landfill and a veneer of turf. And this is the result, is the kind of, I suppose, virtual, but also symbolic kind of terra nullius of Langley Park, such as it looks today. There were grand plans for what was going to happen with this reclaimed area. The Public Works Department did many plans, but the cost of actually reclaiming it was so huge that it didn't leave a lot of impetus or money left for furnishing it as an actual park, and it's remained as this kind of vacuous space ever since. Of course, there's been proposals, and many of them, to actually re-engage with that foreshore space and try and bring back the river to the city. The big problem with the Greenbelt has been this disconnection between city and river. There was a big competition in the 1990s held by the state government. It was won by an international Boston firm with Kevin Lynch, who's a famous urban designer and thinker. And they proposed excavating Langley Park and bringing the river back to the foot of the city where it was meant to originally be, and actually really rendering the foreshores of Bonambiro as a kind of park and actually renaturalising much of those landscapes. But that didn't happen for a whole variety of reasons. The government at the time got caught up in the WI Inc. saga, and the competition entries were then more or less ignored. And we've ended up with a situation much like this today, where there is a kind of straitjacket around Perth Water, which is shown here as river wall. We can see that kind of condition here. And the end result of this long program of reclamation has been that you have to sterilise the river edges in many settings. Much of it is fortified. And this has real implications for how people can engage with the water, but also it tends to sterilise the intertidal zone, which is the most biodiverse and fecund zone you find within most ecosystems. So what this has produced has been a fairly denuded kind of edge condition, and we can see that here. And this is becoming increasingly fortified, and we can see this up and down the Swan River, examples also being in Melville Water when we look at the fortification works which have occurred between the city and the brewery, and between the Narrows Bridge and the brewery. So this edge condition is getting increasingly mineralised, which poses all kinds of issues for how we relate to water and how ecosystems function. So that was looking upriver. We're now going to look downriver and consider particularly how sea level rise could begin to reshape and be a catalyst for rethinking how we consider our foreshores. So sea level rise, here what we have done is to model it in relation to different scenarios. The big issue here is, I think, the interaction between the Central Perth regional parklands and sea level rise. So the Central Perth regional parklands are essentially the foreshores of Bunnaburra, but also spinning out into river run foreshores, heading both inland and towards the coast. And the Central Perth regional parkland provides so many ecosystem services for people who are living in those areas and who are going to be living in increased high density settings. So these are ecosystem services such as mental health and physical health. It is also about ecosystem services in terms of providing biodiversity and enriching these habitats. It's also about ecosystem services which help to protect urban areas adjacent to these foreshore reserves from flooding. So these parklands, these foreshore landscapes, are not just a nice aesthetic kind of green belt, which helps to, I guess, assert Perth's identity as a kind of landscape city. They're also performing many functions. So what we seek to do in this part of the presentation is understand the implication for ecosystem services from sea level rise. So the question then would be, well, what sea level rise projections are you using? The first is an increase of up to about 0.56 metres sea level rise for 2090. Now, this is based on the representative concentration pathway 2.6 from the International Panel for Climate Change. And that's based on net negative carbon emissions. So this is really a best case scenario. So how have we mapped it? We've taken the 0.56 base kind of sea level rise and put a 0.7 metre nominal highest astronomical tide on top of it, which gets you to about 1.26 metres. This is, for 2090, really, this is an optimistic one. It doesn't look that optimistic as a plan, but really this is, you'd have to consider it a kind of base level. So what actually happens is most of the reclaimed areas are actually truly reclaimed. So big issues at the foot of the city here, Langley Park, and also along Terrace Road, some of the development there, compromised Barrack Square is also mostly underwater. And we find certainly Mill Point here is probably the urban area which is most affected. Matagarup, or Harrison Island, returns to being kind of the archipelago as it originally was that we saw from the Woggle image. But it's really important to note that this kind of map, it doesn't factor in floods or storm surges. So if there's a flood in the catchment or a big storm surge associated with a tropical cyclone or something, it could be significantly worse than what is shown here. Okay, so then, well, what is a worst case scenario? Base level sea level rise of about 0.84 metres, which is based on representative concentration pathway 8.5, which is pretty much the worst, plus the 0.7 metre high tide, would look something like this. This takes you about to 1.5 metres. Of course, this is presuming no adaptation, no fortification. This is do nothing, but Mill Point is really more or less Venice. And we've lost the distinctive green belt of the Perth foreshore. It really does not exist, particularly at the foot of the city here, which, you know, if we're adding density and huge, you know, numbers of people to these urban populations surrounding Perth water, this is a really big issue. Finally, we also threw in a low likelihood layer of 2.45 metres, which is based on 1.75 metres sea level rise plus 0.7 metre high tide. This is based on RCP 8.5. So this is worst case, and this is factoring in ice sheet instability, which is that we still don't really quite know how the poles are going to react to global warming. And look, over the longer term, it's not a question of if this will happen, it's more a question of when. As Bill Grace, who worked on this paper with me from Audric, likes to remind me, these projections will be borne out. It's just a matter of when. So we're now entering a process and a period in which we will be adapting Perth and Perth's foreshores, such as they continue to exist, to sea level rise now for centuries. You know, this will be an ongoing process which has been unleashed. And so we need to begin to think of it much more of a process as opposed to something that we often kind of think will kind of stop at 2090 because that's where our projections stop. Indeed, that will not be the case. So to look at this in more detail, we then zoomed into two typical sections, one being Langley Park in the north on Perth's foreshore and one Sir James Mitchell Park. And we then began to test different approaches. Okay, so this is essentially showing here existing conditions. It's showing the 1.26 kind of optimistic scenario and then the 1.54 severe scenario, and showing what happens. These little blue things on the left here are basically showing ecosystem services. So currently, the existing water level, certainly the foreshores are providing a lot of physical health benefits, and they do, to some degree, are mitigating flood risk. However, as we find, in a denied situation, you're essentially losing much of Langley Park. It's not so bad in Sir James Mitchell Park. There's more topography there, but certainly breaching the current river edge. But by the time you get to a 1.54 metre sea level rise, you've essentially completely lost the foreshore, but you're also really having problems with these buildings at the foot of the city along Terrace Road. And of course, the ecosystem services the foreshore was providing are largely gone as it applies to Langley Park. Now, I don't think anyone would say we shouldn't do anything, so that is not likely to be the outcome. What is more likely is that we'll try and fortify the foreshore using built structures. So this could take the form of seawalls, embankments and dikes, and it's the most likely, partly because, the potential flooding of the foreshore is likely to become politicised. And in that setting, any government unwilling to fortify the foreshore will likely incur some kind of political backlash. So there will be a real kind of expectation for fortification of these vulnerable areas. And that's totally understandable, but it could be plagued with problems. Some of them relate to the fact that when you build fortifications, it tends to deflect the energy of the water into areas which are not fortified, and then you can get increasing erosion elsewhere. When you fortify using seawalls, as we know, you get, there's a loss of foreshore wetlands and biodiversity, invertebrates and fish. And you also start to lose the kind of the coastal protection and water quality protection, which goes with wetlands. So there's a whole bunch of issues with the fortification strategy, not least of all, which being they're extremely expensive. The other problem with them is they often provide a false sense of security. So you build a seawall and then actually there's a perception that the problem is solved, and that can actually encourage more development. And then if a sea level rise fortification fails, then you can have a situation where it's, becomes a catastrophic inundation. And we've seen how that can work. So, at a 1.26 metre level, it's likely that fortification would work. However, as we get to higher levels of sea level rise, we're probably going to get to the point where you just can't keep raising the wall. You might go, well, why not? According to our understanding, because much of the foreshore is on a paleo channel, this is like, as it's been described to me, as 70 metres of toothpaste, essentially. This is this ancient muddy landscape which relates to this 60 million year history of the river. It's not easy to just sheet pile the entire thing. And when you fortify something as huge as the foreshores of Bunbury, you then need to fortify it all effectively to create a continuous edge condition to the river. It's unlikely that that will be something we can afford or will be able to maintain over the longer term. It's not to say we won't do it in the shorter term, but there's a potential that we could be facing a kind of catastrophic inundation if you relied on that in isolation. So it has some kind of vulnerabilities. Other approaches would be accommodation. So this is things like provisions for water pumping, floodgates on buildings, elevated floor levels, movable buildings and designs. It's also about trying to build a kind of wetland edge to the river, which can help out to soak up sort of storm surges and floods and slow the movement of water down through the city to the river. So accommodation strategies like this, which is essentially adaptation, could see some kind of recasting of the foreshore as more of a wetland environment, moving away from kind of active recreation, at least ball sports, to something which is more about passive recreation, which is much more densely planted and can really help to absorb water moving through the system. It might be about building, that when we do rebuild buildings along Terrace Road, for instance, that we do it in a way where it is able to be flooded and still operate at some level. It might be about roof gardens, which help to slow the movement of water down into the river. And we find that at a 1.26 metre water level, that could have some real benefits in terms of ecosystem service provision. I think this could create a river edge which is more biodiverse, for instance, which is really good for the mental health of the people around it, which still provides opportunities for recreation. But what we find again is when you get to those higher water levels, it's really hard to hang on to it. And the foreshore landscape is largely gone, and you're still dealing with the situation of flooding along Terrace Road. So there's concerns about how this would play out over the longer term. Probably, the most drastic to most people's way of thinking, and possibly even the most unlikely, at least in the short term, is that you would try and retreat. So it's a kind of planned withdrawal from the foreshore. So this would be, demolishing unserviceable buildings at the end of their lifespan, rezoning adjacent urban areas as foreshore. And what this could allow is a kind of landward migration of the foreshore over time. But this is something that you need to do over an incredibly long period. But it will include things like restrictions on the development of low-lying land, which can be controversial and divisive. So the idea here is that as buildings reach the end of their lifespan, essentially you wouldn't rebuild them. You would try and orchestrate land swaps, and there would be a slow process of just not consolidating further urbanisation here, but slowly pulling back from the coast in an orderly kind of withdrawal. Now we have time. The projections here we're talking for are 2090, and there are precedents in Western Australia for how we do this, for how you might consider the development of a freeway, where government buys up land strategically over time and allows the creation of a freeway reserve. Something similar could happen here. Now, this is obviously runs into all kinds of political issues, but the advantage of doing something like this is that you get to really maintain the full width and generosity of the foreshore landscape of the Central Perth Regional Parklands, and it essentially migrates inland over time. Now, of course, fortification would occur within this, but this would be the overall strategy within which you would, in a more temporary sense, deploy others. But we'd have to concede it's not going to be popular. Anxious communities would generally advocate for a traditional fortified response, and we could see a real backlash, and there has been a backlash from many coastal communities against managed retreat policies. And it raises concerns regarding government liability for property loss. Nonetheless, we have time, and we could orchestrate a process somewhat like this. Ironically, in the end, if you did something like this and you did begin to retreat these foreshore areas as sea levels rise, you would end up basically getting back to the original park that Stirling proposed, which is where St George's Terrace, which was referred to as a terrace because you had a view of the river, actually becomes the edge of the park and the kind of edge of the city. From there, most of the buildings, because you've moved up significantly in terms of topography, most buildings would then be safe. So there's a kind of interesting future history on the foreshore, which in time it could resemble something like that original park that Stirling had proposed. So look, thanks for listening. In summary, while in the 20th century, we were able to really reshape the river in terms of our own symbolic or pragmatic agendas, we are going to find that as we move forward, the river increasingly reasserts its ability to reshape the city. And this is a process now that will go on for centuries and requires a different form of planning and a different mindset, I think, in terms of how we go about considering planning Central Perth and its foreshores. We need now to be thinking in a really long-term sense, thinking how we can use sea level rise as a catalyst for doing things differently, I think, for breathing life back into these Central Perth regional parkland foreshores, and doing it in a way which provides ecosystem services. And I think we need to be, as Matthew Gandy explains, our thinking around such issues needs to be realistic yet aspirational, and we've really directed this work to that end. I just wanted to quickly credit the team who worked on this paper. So that is myself and Paula Hooper, who's also co-director of Audric, and Nicole Edwards, researcher at Audric, both public health specialists, Sarah Foster, also a public health specialist, and Bill Grace, who's a systems thinker and engineer, and who provided much advice around the fortification and adaptation strategies. Thanks for listening, and happy to take questions.
That was amazing, Julian.